You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, just a quick heads up before we get started with the episode. We did talk about a number of different artists, but the subject today was particularly focused on women who have been historically underrepresented and marginalized in different ways. And in the course of that discussion, there was mention of some traumatic lived experiences of those women. While we weren't explicit in the discussion, as this is an all ages show, if you don't want to hear about that kind of thing, you might want to select a different episode.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, Weekly Art History for All Ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I have two guests joining me. Lori Zimmer and Maria Krasinski are the author and illustrator behind the book I'm Not Your Muse, uncovering the overshadowed brilliance of women artists and visionaries. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having us. Kyle.
I really appreciate your taking the time. Now, I gotta ask, it feels like kind of an obvious question given the title, but what inspired you to write the book? How did this come about?
Well, this is our third book together. Maria and I have been friends since we were kids. And our first book is called Art Hiding in New York. The second is called Art Hiding in Paris. And in those, I'm a research nerd, and I delve into like art historical stories in both cities. And being the research nerd I kept coming across women that I found like very interesting, but I didn't know that much about, which surprised me in my nerdery of research. And I kind of kept tabs on them. And so eventually that list just grew and grew, and the book kind of revealed itself. And what I mean by the list of women were just like underrepresented women in my purview of research. So basically put it together, and our publisher agreed.
Yeah, there's a couple of women in the book who you'll find in Art Hiding in New York or Art Hiding in Paris, but there was so much about them that they deserved a little more time to shine in this one.
Okay, so then, the natural question, you said you two have known each other for so long. Maria, as an illustrator, it seems to me very obvious, the art background. And Lori, I'm curious, if you're a writer, but you have 3 art history books now, was your first passion in the writing and the research? Are you an art historian? Like, what's your background? How did you two come together? Why the focus on the arts and all of that?
Well, I've been an art nerd since I was a kid. I always loved how art history told another side of history from the reflections of the people that were living it, rather than written history, which is curated and controlled by whomever is in charge of writing. And my background, I actually used to work in the art world for about 15 years before I turned to writing books. I worked in galleries. I have a master's in art history. And although I really loved working in that field, commodifying art wasn't really for me. It was researching and learning more, and then sharing that knowledge with other people is really where my passion lies. And I try to write these books in an approachable voice, kind of like your podcast, where I believe we both believe that art is for everyone, not just for scholars and students, and you can appreciate it on multiple layers. So that's sort of the impetus for these books, was to share that passion and hopefully turn someone who is intimidated by art and artists and art history into a fan, or just to feel a little bit welcome, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I got to say, something I found interesting and unique as I was reading your book, the voice I found kind of interesting, because there were certain turns of phrase that felt almost poetic to me and sort of elevated. And then there'd be a parenthetical that was just like so plain spoken, and it felt conversational. And to get both of those tones simultaneously, I thought was just a really enjoyable experience as a reader. And I do want to make sure that I'm also bringing Maria into the conversation. I enjoyed your illustrations, your style and everything. Can you talk a little bit about, since we're talking about art history and everything, can you talk a little bit about how you approach that? Because as an artist and an art lover myself, I think there's something unique about the challenge of tackling art history and still maintaining your own lens. Like, how did you balance that? Did you feel sort of a pressure to portray an artist in their style, or were you comfortable making it your own? Like, can you talk about that and your background, your style, and how the history influenced it?
Yeah, I think I was extra conscious with this one because if you have seen our previous two books, they're about urban landscapes. So it's a lot of buildings, it's a lot of public art. I love drawing architecture. I love drawing what I'm seeing in front of me. And those books have a very, like you're looking at my sketchbook, like it's meant to be kind of as if I was standing in front of this artwork, this building that used to be, Andy Warhol's home and studio. So it's kind of a loose style. But when we came to this book, we decided, agreed right on, of course, it's about these women, so it would be portrait based. And so kind of conceptualizing what that would look like, it's not necessarily a place based, but it's a person based approach. And so my background, I started out in painting. That's how I was trained in school. So I brought more of a kind of painterly portrait approach to these, still starting with kind of just sketching ideas. But that's why this style is a little different from the first two books. And being conscious of, when you're drawing other artists, like to be influenced, but not just mimicking, copying exactly. So with each portrait, I looked at different historical photos, combining elements from here and there, looking at historic fashion and the theme sort of the times to compose the portrait. But then the backgrounds for most of the pieces draw from elements of their life, or if they were a visual artist, it's sort of a facet or a snippet of one of their works to kind of bring in their voice, their style merged with my own. And so everything that is there for a reason. There are lots of Easter eggs.
I would love to add to that and just say that for both of us, like there was like a tremendous pressure to get it right because like we have like such respect for these women as opposed to just like writing about artworks in my past book, it's open to interpretation, but like these women are included in this book because we feel like they deserved more. So like for both of us, we were just like really extra perfectionist, if there's such a thing. Yeah.
I did on that note, however, I was like, well, this is the upside of them being slightly lesser known is, maybe people don't generally know what they look like. Whereas if I'm drawing, Frida Kahlo, people be like, where's her eyebrows?
Yeah.
So
right.
There was a slightly less pressure there.
This is why I love hearing about process from artists, because there's always so much more than is immediately apparent to me. And I love hearing about the level of thought that goes into every element that goes into the work. And I have to imagine, and I guess, to not sidetrack too much on process here, you talked about on this book in particular, it was important to you to get it right. And I think this to me feels like it would be a challenging topic because you are trying to portray artists who are underappreciated, that you feel have been overlooked, and you want to do justice to them. And so what I heard in there was kind of the criticism that you would worry about is not so much the audience of the readers, but really, how would the artists feel about their portrayal in there? And I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic because I am always worried about like, what are people going to say on the Spotify comments? What are people going to say in the YouTube comments? Like, what are my current peers going to think of me? And then I just stop looking at comments and realize I'm just trying to put out some nice content. So please don't write your hate mail. But as you were looking at this book and you're researching, you came across so many stories of women that were interesting.
Yeah.
And like, I personally think of, the Marcel Duchamp and The Fountain, and Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven was an interesting story that I didn't know until I was researching Duchamp for that episode years ago. What are some stories that really grabbed your attention and made you feel like this needs to be a book? Like, what did you stumble across in the research here?
One of the stories that struck me, being a person that I study, for some reason, I'm really interested in Paris art history, and Maria lives there, which has only enhanced my ability to really dive into the history of Paris, from the Belle Epoque to interwar Paris. I just find it I just find it all really fascinating, because it was this hub in the pre-internet, pre-digital media world, where instead of like looking for inspiration on your phone, you're like, if you were a serious artist, or you would like, I have to go study in Paris because that's where everyone is gathering. And that was true also of China went through a lot in the early 1900s, Cultural Revolution, and there was a point where they began to embrace Western culture. And there was, believe it or not, they even sent female painters to Paris to study. And one of them was Pan Yu Liang, and she was the first Chinese painter to paint in the Western style. She was super inspired by Impressionism and whatnot. And she kind of took that to the next level by shirking the traditional subjects for Chinese women to paint, which were nature, butterflies, portraits, calm, basic scenarios that really didn't mean anything more decorative than anything, I guess is what I would say. And she turned it on her own body. And she painted, for the first time, painted brown bodies. She painted women that she met in bathhouses. When she couldn't afford models, she would paint herself. And for the most part, I was just surprised to have never heard of her, because I've studied a lot of feminist art and in my art historical, knowledge. And she was one that just was completely unknown to me. And the disappointing thing comes in modernity a little bit. So I think like maybe 10, 15 years ago in the aughts, there was an exhibition of hers. And so she got a little bit of attention. And I was really, really disappointed to see modern media, including some writers that I actually know in life, focus on a really bad part of her life. So when she was a child, her parents died, and this is the early 1900s, and her uncle, basically, she was 13 years old, sold her to a brothel. So she was a trafficked child. And instead of focusing on the fact that she was a trafficked child, all of these articles came up with these very cutesy turn of phrases like from prostitute to painter, from brothel to Belle Epoque. And it was just like really disappointing that despite everything she's went through, despite all the things that she's done, she was like the first to do so many things, and that modern writers just treated her in the same way that she was treated back then. And I think that was maybe the most shocking thing to me. Was you can't even blame it on the past or say that things were different then and blah, blah, blah. This was like, these are like colleagues and peers that I have met in my New York world.
And I think that became a through line as we come across other, women and artists, through history, this sort of like lazy and reductive shorthand that was used to describe a lot of them. Like Lori said, these like pithy little sayings, or she was an artist in her own right.
In her own right. Oh.
Like very reductive language that we just saw over and over again that really made these fully fleshed out, talented women seem so one-dimensional or just kind of a fad or an accessory.
Yeah, it's amazing when I've also come across like, primary sources about Frida Kahlo that are like newspapers from her time saying like, oh, isn't it cute? Diego's wife also paints. And it's
Yeah.
Dabbling,
Exactly.
yeah.
you
Yeah.
kind of expect a certain amount of that from sources 100 years ago, but like you say, when it's current and contemporary and you feel like we've made a lot of progress and you see stuff that is a reminder of, oh, there's still quite a ways to go.
Mhm.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, there is something about Paris in that modern era, the Belle Epoque, which I appreciate your saying for me, and I know you're a listener because you referenced the episode where I was struggling with that and so many other French phrases. But now I've
I
got
cannot
someone.
wait to read that book. I cannot. I have it, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah.
The club, it's right up my alley. I congratulate her.
Yeah, I mean,
Jennifer.
Dazzle is like I said in the episode, she's the gold standard as far as I'm
Totally.
concerned. So, listeners, I'll put a link in the show notes. But what I was saying is, I also find that time period fascinating, and we have figures that are often forgotten. I honestly don't remember hearing about like Amrita Shergill during my art history survey courses and stuff. There's so many interesting figures. And now after a short break, I do want to get into a little bit more about specific stories and artists you shared in your book. I'm back now with Lori Zimmer and Maria Krasinski, the author and illustrator behind I'm Not Your Muse, uncovering the overshadowed brilliance of women artists and visionaries. It's a great book. I enjoyed it. There are a lot of stories that honestly I was not familiar with. And, in the course of this episode, we obviously cannot get to all of them. But I did ask you ahead of time if you could share a little bit, because I think specificity is so crucial to understanding. Could you tell us a little bit about the artists you picked? I think it was the final chapter, the witches that came together in Mexico, right? After the war?
Yes. So during the war. So Kachi Horna, Remedios Varo, and Leonora Carrington, who is probably the most known of the trio, they crossed paths in the surrealist circle in Paris at one time or another, but I like to call them, they were hi-bye friends. They knew of each other, but they were all busy doing their own things. Kachi Horna was a photographer born in Budapest, and she was covering the Spanish Civil War. As was Remedios Varo, was also covering the war, and Leonora was moved from England to try to be a painter alongside Max Ernst and whatnot. So why I chose them was basically during, they were escaping the Nazis, and they all found themselves for different reasons, which is longer stories, in Mexico City and in the same neighborhood, Colonia Roma. And at first I chose them because I really respect how they had taken surrealism, which in Paris had a few women involved, but for the most part, the artists saw them as femmes enfants, like women, children that were supposed to be pretty and beautiful. They were much younger than most of the surrealist artists. And so although they were welcome at the table, they weren't taken fully seriously as artists, although they were all making their own work at the time. But Mexico City kind of gave them this freedom of separating themselves from Paris, where they could pick up on surrealism and take it where they wanted to. And they did. They were extremely prolific, and were continuing to explore it right through the 1950s. But I think that the real reason that I am so enamored of them was their deep friendship and relationship that they found within each other, the ultimate inspiration. They were catalysts for each other's work in both their personal lives and their artworks. And you can see that in some of their photographs, like Kachi Horna. She started out as a war photographer, but her surrealist photography you can see that not just the influence of Remedios Varo's paintings and Leonora Carrington's paintings, but they actually work together. She often used each of them as models and also included props, like artworks that they had made in her own photographs, which I don't know how many artists you know today, but a lot of them are really gatekeepy about their own work and they don't want to share, like to include another artist's work in your work is sort of a big deal. And you have to have implicit either trust or you're just doing it without permission, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And so I just think that they created this sort of magical life for themselves that also happened to be extremely prolific because of their support system. And I just wonder, like, how amazing, like, what we could create as well, I'm not an artist, but what artists could create if they had that kind of support, control, and inspiration that was just without any kind of competition. I just find it magical.
It is. I mean, it feels like it's the dream that so many artists have talked about. Like I think of, Van Gogh and the little house in Arles, and, like so many artists want and describe a yearning for that supportive relationship with fellow like-minded artists. And it's really interesting that, early to mid 20th century period, the wars were so disruptive. And in your book, you talk about, the immense destructive power of them and the trauma of the wars, but also creating this opportunity for so many people to be tossed together because those three artists, I believe all three of them were from different countries to begin with, right?
Yeah, Hungary, Spain, and England.
Yeah. So, I mean, they likely never would have even met. And then, fleeing the horrors of the war, coming to New Mexico, they came together to create something really interesting.
Mexico City.
What did I say?
New Mexico.
Words are hard.
Words are hard.
Yeah.
So I draw.
We'll leave it in. It's fine.
I love it.
My listeners are used to me not being able to say words.
We're human.
So just to bring us back on topic here, they were three kind of different artists. Can you give us I hate to be reductionist, but we also are limited on time. Can you talk through a little bit, like, what was Carrington's work like? What was Varo's work? Can you talk about each of those three individual artists and styles? Because we have painters, we have photographers. Like, can you just give us the Cliff's Notes version of them?
Well, first the chapter is called we should all be witches, and the reason for that is while they coincidentally found themselves in the same neighborhood in Mexico City, they really got interested in like the occult and mysticism as a study. So you can kind of see that reflected in all of their artworks. There's definitely mystical references, but Leonora Carrington, in summary, she was a British from an aristocrat family, and she rejected it and wanted to be an artist. And, her family, after she moved to Paris and was with Max Ernst, and when he was taken away and put in a concentration camp, she had a nervous breakdown, and her family had her put in an asylum. Institutionalized. Yeah. And she escaped, and that's how she ended up in Mexico City. But her work very much reflects, it explores, she uses animal imagery a lot, and women and mysticism, but it also kind of explores her time in the institutional, like her institutional life and the horrors. Like, she was one of the first people, I believe, to be tested for shock therapy. So she went through hell, and she discusses that in her paintings through the lens of mysticism and dreams, which I find really interesting. And I'm guessing she did that in order to like make peace with it herself, because it's a really tough thing to confront your trauma. So I think that my personal interpretation is that was like the way that she rationalized it and made herself able to deal with it. Remedios Varo's paintings, I think if you show them side by side, you can tell subject matter and aura and vibes are very similar in the like mystical influence to it, but Varro was very obviously influenced by Renaissance painting. If you look at just her characters and even the architecture that she paints really reminds me of those fabulous Renaissance paintings where it's like a saint and then the background you can see tiny details of a city in like, far away. And that kind of reminds me of Varro's work is like if you took those cities and you magnified them and you saw these like crazy mystical things happening. And I consider Kati Horna, like her photography when she was a photojournalist on like during the Spanish Civil War, she employed a method that we are now calling gender witnessing, in that like up until that time, any coverage of war was about soldiers and front lines and like what the soldiers were going through. And she turned the lens on the women and children and civilians that were affected by it. And her point was to show the resilience of women that had to deal with what she was saying, like these men's war, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then she, like surrealism came from a place of that, from trying to understand and make sense of World War I, of war. And so she dove headlong into surrealism for her photographs. I think that a lot of them show juxtapositions of architecture that was decrepit, or, they kind of remind me of scenes of the war, like mixed with like her surrealist thoughts. I just think that each one was each artist's way of dealing with war and the atrocities of war and how to make sense of it in their minds.
Yeah, but I think there's also something interesting about, you talk about the surrealist movement being born out of making sense of the horrors of war and all of that. But I'm not going to pretend I had this insight. I feel like if I recall correctly in your book, you said something that kind of struck me about how a lot of the surrealists, they were looking at Freud and they were looking at these ideas of psychology, and it felt like this sort of exterior order and scientific principles being applied to the arts. Whereas when we look at like Carrington's work, it's much more about the inner world being expressed, and it has a sort of idiosyncratic individuality to it. If that's
I totally agree. Like, I think all three of the women, their work is personal. Like, they're using surrealism as a lens to express things that they've gone through. Whereas what you're just referencing, I think like a lot of like the early surrealists or like famous paintings, like are more about process and like, look what we can do. Look how we can look at things differently. It's more like showing process as opposed to personal, like New Descending Staircase, Duchamp was like,
yeah,
look how we can look at a body from all these different angles at the same time. Whereas these women, their work is about looking at their own memories through that lens rather than just an example, rather than a demonstration.
And there's just something very mind-bending about them doing these very personal, introspective works and coming together to do these very personal individual works. That, like, I don't know, it's interesting to me in a way that I'm struggling to wrap my head around, but I guess that's surrealism in a nutshell.
I think it's also interesting that today when we look at these works, even, and like I said before, I try to look at art, and it's really hard for the amount of researching that I do for fun, but I try to look at it as if I don't know anything about it. I try to just my first judgment is always just visuals. What am I looking at? And I think that we would agree that like all of these three women's work, we kind of look at as like, oh, that's so pretty and ethereal and ooh, dreamlike, and without realizing the places that it came from of distress.
Oh, see, that's interesting to me because when I'm going to, so like these are artists that I didn't know a ton about before. I'm not going to pretend I know about a ton about them now, but I know more than I did before our conversation started. But like Vara was the one that I was most familiar with. Probably,
Oh, interesting.
I think I had heard about her work from, friend of the pod, probably Tim Bogatz, who, from the Art of Education University, I think had first turned me onto her work. But I think my connection is I almost see that as like a connect. I think of like Hieronymus Bosch when I look at her work. Like there's
Yeah.
something pretty isn't the word I'd use to describe it. Interesting, complex, nuanced. But I wouldn't have thought pretty. That was an interesting descriptor to me. I mean,
think
yes, ethereal and dreamlike.
The little
I
characters, they're like
Yeah.
their perfect little hair, and there'll be like 10 of the same character. I don't know. I understand what you're saying. I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah,
But
I also feel bad because I feel like Maria is I feel so bad because I'm
No.
not getting your opinion, and we're talking about women's voices not being heard historically.
No, it's
What are
always,
your
well,
thoughts? Do you have a favorite in these artists, or like a story that stood out to you?
I have loads of favorites. I mean, it was so hard to narrow this down. But actually something Lori just said reminded me, and we've said this before, you're talking about process and how some of the male artists, say the surrealist movement, a lot of their work was privileging the process, and that's what stood forward. And I think there are parallels in film. And one of our favorites is Alice Guy Blaché, the mother of the movies, we call her in the book, the first woman film director who was creating film at the same time as, Georges Méliès, the Lumière brothers. Those are contemporaries. But she was the first one to move it from a demonstration film to think narratively. Like, how do we use this medium, not just to show what we can do with these fancy cameras and these techniques, but to actually tell a story? And she revolutionized editing, special effects, built some of these stories. And she made over 100 films, over 1,000 films, thousands of films.
She
Or
only
maybe they
found
only
like
found
100.
100.
Yeah.
That's what she made, over 1,000 films. I mean, read her chapter because she reached heights of fame and renown. Then, like many women, unfortunately, had all of her life's works discredited, credited to her husband, to her boss, lost kind of everything. But one thing I do love about her story, which I wish more of the people in our book had this, is towards the end of her life, she actually tracked down her film. She recuperated her own reputation and image by reclaiming her place as much as she could in the pantheon of film directors. And so I think that someone else taking credit for your work is a very common theme. Seeing the possibility and the opportunities in a medium is another theme we see with some of the artists, and like fighting for her place while she was still alive.
Yeah. And that is so interesting. You don't think of filmmakers as having need to be told, like, if you're going to film something, a story might be nice, have a point.
Yeah, exactly.
But in those early days, you're right. It was just like, well, this is a tool to document the world and what's happening around us right now. And, that whole narrative structure and the art to it had to come from somewhere. And it's kind of amazing that we don't hear these names more often.
Yeah.
Méliès is one that I talk about a lot, but I'm not going to even try another pronunciation because I didn't get that one. But you're right.
Great.
It's a fascinating story, and the book is full of these interesting stories. So now, after one last short break, we're going to try to wrap it up and talk a little bit more about the through lines and the takeaways. My guest this week wrote I'm Not Your Muse, Uncovering the Overshadowed Brilliance of Women Artists and Visionaries. Listeners, if you're interested in the book, it is available at all your favorite booksellers. I'll, of course, leave links in the show notes. But Lori, Maria, thank you so much for sharing your time. The book is fantastic, but I always like to wrap things up by kind of asking about your key takeaways. We've kind of alluded to the through lines for this book. What are you hoping that people will pick up from it or take away from it? Or I guess we'll do sort of a choose your own adventure. Why do you feel like this book is particularly relevant right now?
Good question.
Great question. I think for what I hope people take away from it, there's two separate things. I hope that the overall message to me is no matter how much you try to diminish or erase someone, in this case, women will that brilliance will still prevail. You can't stop brilliance. You can keep adding things on like repressive techniques, societal repression, but the people who can will find a way and will still create things. The other hope to take away is specifically to writers who want to get into writing biographies. I hope that a writer out there is inspired by these little vignettes and gives these women a full biography that they deserve, which is not, I'm not that person. I like to teach a lot of things, but I do hope that this inspires that because, I've read every biography that is available out there for these women. A lot of them have been out of print for 50 years, and rightfully so, because they're very dry and not compelling. And I do hope that these women become more recognizable through that. That's my wish.
And I'm just going to add to that, if you do go out and write a good biography of any of these women, please reach out to me because I would love to plug the book and learn more about them.
Yes. One thing I'll just add is I hope that, people are inspired by these histories. They go out and they want to learn more. But one thing I have found too with maybe other art history nerds too, they'll say, "Oh, is so-and-so in the book?" And I'm like, "No, who is that?" And then, we just keep adding to that list. And so just keep sharing great artists that you think haven't had their time in the spotlight. Keep looking for who is not in the story, or have that critical eye when you see something like she was an artist in her own right. Like, just really try to surface more of these people who deserve our attention and time. And
Okay, so if I could put you on the spot, I'm going to ask you for some artist recommendations that we haven't mentioned in this episode yet. So I'm drawing this question out to give you a moment of think time, but I would love to hear from each of you, 2 or 3 artists whose work you find beautiful and inspiring that you would want listeners to seek out and learn more about, whether they are in your book or you've learned about them since then or from some other time. But I would love to get some artist recommendations to broaden all of our horizons.
Leonore Finney, Tina Madati, they're both kind of in that surrealist circle lens. Maria, do you have any? I know you have a zillion, actually.
No, but this is the on the spot, like, who? Actually, one who I just learned about when I was talking with somebody about this, and they said, "Oh, is Paula Rego in there? It's my favorite artist." I'm like, "No, who is that?" And I went down a total rabbit hole. I don't know if you're familiar with her, Lori. I didn't know her. She's a Portuguese artist, painter, and I think her work is beautiful. So that's my current, I need to know more about her, and my current rabbit hole.
Yeah, those are mine too. They change every so often, but I've been on those I've been in a surrealist mode lately. So,
what is it about the surrealism movement that is so I don't know. There's some of it that I find absolutely astonishing and fascinating, and the connections I find interesting, and some of it just feels, I don't know, like weird for the sake of weird. You know what I'm
Forced.
saying? Like
I agree.
You see there's something really interesting about that movement and something really just mind-numbingly awful about that movement at the same time.
Right. Like when it's good, it's good. When it's bad, it's bad. I think for like my attraction to it is it wasn't the first, but it was the most extreme break from, centuries of academic painting. It was just really like, what? And so I even appreciate the ones that are visually unsuccessful because it really, like, imagine for centuries of, aside from like Bosch and some Jan van Eyck, like being told that you had to paint representationally in a certain way and things had to be idealized. And then now you're like, cutting out lips and putting them in the sky. I don't know. I just appreciate the attempt at undoing what was learned for so many generations.
Yeah, I guess there is something interesting about like finally letting people have just total freedom. Anything goes, and it becomes, the train wreck you can't look away from sometimes, but there's still something interesting. Yeah, I guess you're right. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
I'm not sure if you also got to take a look at our cards as well. This was a new thing for us, aside from just the book. For those who are not big readers, which I highly respect, we all take in our media and our knowledge in different ways. Our publisher also put out this a inspiration deck that comes with a little miniature synopses of each artist, but it includes, I believe, nine more women than the book. And the reason being is those 9 women I wanted to put in the book, but I could not find enough information on them which kind of saddens me, but I still wanted to give them their due. So they are just as important as the other 31 women.
And I love that. And as somebody who teaches art, I always love when information is accessible beyond a book format. You got to meet people where they are. And, this work is wonderful. The illustrations are beautiful. The images and the writing is wonderful as well. I said, it feels both elevated and conversational, telling me about artists I kind of wish I knew more about. So thank you once again. I really appreciate your taking your time and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Kyle. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.